On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a warning on tariffs, chipping away global economic growth.
The impact on global growth would be severe.
The latest forecast in the OECD economic outlook. And as the Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations in Beijing draws to a close, the lessons from the confluence of cultures.
And welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, has cut its forecast for global economic growth this year, warning about the effect of escalating trade tensions. The OECD singles out trade tensions as the biggest dampener on global growth, noting trade is expected to grow just to 2% this year, the lowest in a decade. Take a look.
In the OECD's new global economic outlook on Tuesday, its forecast for global GDP growth is to slow to 3.2% this year from 3.5% last year. Global trade is projected to grow by only 2.1% this year, almost half of last year's growth and the lowest rate in a decade. The OECD said extra tariffs announced earlier this month by Washington and Beijing would chip away growth of the U.S. and Chinese economies. The U.S. economy is forecast to slow by 0.1 percentage point to 2.8% this year and slip to 2.3% next year. Chinese GDP growth will also slow from 6.2% to 6% in the next 2 years. The report says trade tensions have disrupted global growth.
The main and most urgent issue is the weakness of global trade, and particularly for Europe and China. Tariff hikes and even more the climate of high uncertainty that the trade disputes have created have undermined confidence. Firms have shelved their investment plans. The manufacturing sector has been particularly hit. And the sharp deceleration of trade since last year mirrors the rise in policy uncertainty. And as you can see from this graph, in the first 2 months of 2019, global trade has barely grown at all.
OECD officials expressed confidence in China's economic growth despite a prolonged trade dispute with the U.S. While China's economy is slowing down, it's also rebalancing.
The more an economy develops and catches up with advanced economy, the less it relies on export-driven growth and manufacturing, and the more it will rely increasingly on services and consumption. So we're moving away from an export-driven development model to a consumption-driven model. It's good because that way China will depend less on its export markets. And it's also a sign that China's population is becoming richer and feeling better.
The OECD report said the battle over tariffs of China in the U.S. will not only hurt the Chinese economy, but it will also directly hit the American economy. OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria called on countries to solve problems through dialogues and to work on challenges to the current multilateral trading system.
On the OECD economic outlook and the potential escalation of trade tensions, not just between China and the United States, but other economies as well, we are joined by a strong panel. Southampton in Britain, we invited Mike Bastian, a visiting professor of the University of International Business. In Washington, D.C., Paulo von Schirach, the president of the Global Policy Institute. And in Hong Kong, Hong Hao, managing director and head of research of Volcom International. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. 2% about growth rate for China if trade escalate the tension. So what do you think, Mr. Hong, while you are in Hong Kong, is the chilling effect already on the horizon?
I think the market is feeling it already. I think both the Hong Kong market and the Asia market are down quite a bit. And the U.S. market is just starting its adjustment. I think most participants in the markets are very cautious about the outlook, and also, if you look at the housing market here in Hong Kong, it's also cooling down as well. So I think people are hunkering down for a uncertain future.
It is not just China and the United States, but other economies as well. Mr. Von Chirac, in France, we understand, according to OECD estimate, it's likely to be 3.9%. It's actually going to be much lower than last year, 3.9%, and 5.5% the year before the last. So how do you see this trend? What does it mean for economies in your part of the world?
Well, look, there's no doubt that when the two major economies in the world, that is China and the United States, are having this protracted disagreement, to use a polite word, on trade and many other issues that affect both economies, there are huge ripple effects. It's no mystery that Chinese exports to the United States rely on vast and complex supply chains that come from all over Asia and other parts of the world. Japan's exports to China have collapsed, literally, from year-on-year data. And so Japan, which is not a party to this dispute, is being affected. And Europe is being affected too, because there are ripple effects that mean that there's fewer opportunities for European exports to China and vice versa, even though the dispute doesn't affect directly EU and Chinese trade relations. So this is a big problem.
We've already seen other economies having their own complex issues. The UK, for example, Professor Bastian, you know better than I do, with the Brexit and also the uncertainties created by that of a no-ending result yet, and now another layer of big uncertainty of the global economy as a result of trade war. So what does that mean from your perspective?
Well, certainly for the UK economy, there's enough uncertainty when it comes to Brexit, and there's still a lot of uncertainty. There may be political change far sooner than expected. But as the other panelists have said, when the two major economies around the world are really at loggerheads, and there doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel at the moment, there's no real grounds for optimism at all. Trump seems very, very resolute. He doesn't appear to be wanting to compromise. That has a massive ripple effect where there are integrated supply chains all around the world. It is a globalized, interconnected world economy, and you can't escape that fact. So the sooner we have some sort of break in this deadlock and some progress between the US in particular and their attitude to trade liberalization, the better.
But Mr. Chirac, you can see that President Trump, coming from the U.S., keep on saying that it is not the American farmers and the American consumers that are going to pay for that, but others rather, namely in his debate, China. But we all know the economy doesn't work like that. But he keep on saying that. Whether people believe him or not, particularly his voters and constituencies, that's their issue. But the question really is, it's really not like that.
I mean, we know it's not like that, but he keeps saying it anyway, and he keeps saying that trade wars are great and that the United States will come, in the end, will come off on top, the winner. That's, it's a gamble, not something that has been done on this scale. I mean, there have been trade disputes before. We all know that, whether it be China or the EU or the negotiations for the renovation or renewal, rather, or update of NAFTA, issues with Japan, but not on this scale and not this protracted. And of course we know that there are certain American economic sectors that are already suffering, namely the farmers, who happen to be, by the way, some of the, coming from a part of the United States, the Midwest, which is sort of the core political support for Mr. Trump that helped him to gain the presidency back in 2016. I am not quite sure what the game plan is. The idea is that they can sort of force China into a more malleable negotiating position that would deal with many other issues that are really beyond the trade imbalance, which is what triggered the current negative climate. There are all kinds of other issues on the table, as we all know. But again, President Trump keeps saying we're going to win this one. We'll see.
What does that mean, win this one? Of course, that's up to interpretation. Professor Bastian, we all understand the American farmers, the American agriculture, in fact, to a certain extent is based on exports, particularly its exports to China. Now, there are certain reports suggesting the American farmers are diverting their export markets. For example, European countries could be taking a share of it, but the question really is how big. So what do you make of the argument like this, and an argument based on which it seems that the whole administration of the United States is now approaching and having a big impact on economies, including yours?
Well, Trump's words are shallow, to say the least, and we're seeing that these tariffs are increasingly causing a burden for U.S. companies, for U.S. consumers. Walmart recently publicly said prices will rise. Retail trade groups have warned that retail prices will become the norm, so it's not just the farmers that are suffering. 41%, something like that, of all apparel imported into the US comes from China. 72% of all footwear imported into the US comes from China. So these price rises will hurt the American consumer and American families. There's no doubt about that. So Trump has got that spectacularly wrong. More and more people will tell him that. Let's hope that puts pressure on him. The timing is also interesting of these hikes. It's likely to hit the American family for back-to-school shopping time, when the kids go back to school in September. So it could be, in the short term, the positive way of looking at this, it could put a lot of pressure on Trump and almost force him to backtrack, which he has done in the past.
Yeah. Mr. Hong, from China's perspective, if you think about it as an economist, this is only the very first of a string of things that President Trump and his administration aspire to do. I mean, having a trade war with China, forcing and cornering the so-called opponent of a trade discussion, therefore to win the upper hand. Next, you have Japan, you will have the European countries, you will have probably Southeast Asian countries as well. So what does it mean, China now with the United States, the precedence that's likely to be set over there, and its implications for the other economies, discussions and negotiations with the U.S. about trade?
Yeah, well, I think, for now, it's a challenge that the Chinese people are facing. And also, I would doubt that the U.S. can open war with so many different economies at the same time. It would be almost impossible. And also, people should keep in mind that the U.S. market hasn't corrected, and also the Trump's approval rating, for some reason, is still staying at a very high level. I think, even though some of the U.S. economies are feeling the pain because of the tariff increase, but I think, most U.S. people are still, thinking that Trump is doing a good job until the pain of the tariff really hits the U.S. economy and the U.S. market start to crash down. So I would say that, it's not likely that he can open fire on so many different countries, but then at the same time, I think one of the two sort of key measures to watch really is the U.S. market performance and also the approval ratings.
Well, of course, no matter how many warnings that you guys have sent to the other side, I'm afraid that the other side would not withdraw from the current demands until it sees the bad results for real. So I guess that's the issue everybody has to bear in mind. Having said that, though, Mr. Hong, I want to ask you about this. As an economist in China, how do you see really the potential of the size of the market being functioning as the driving force of the growth of the Chinese economy? As you can see from the case study of Huawei, Dajiang, and several other technology-related companies that are operating globally, the U.S. is trying to, at least for the moment, to enlist it on some kinds of blacklist. Are we seeing at this moment already a technological divide Washington aspires to create? What does that mean overall for the Chinese economy?
Yeah, I think the risk is rising, and also, in the coming weeks, probably the headline risk is rising as well. So it would make people feel that the pressure is building up, and also the situation, appears that it's worsening. But having said that, many of the technology firms that you mentioned just now have, 6 to 9 months worth of inventory. So, I think for the first 6 to 9 months, many of them should be fine. And also, as a leading Chinese technology firm, Huawei, probably other technology firms as well, they would have a backup plan. So I would say that, yeah, even though the situation now is looking precarious, but I would say, since 2018, since the trade dispute started, I think some companies should have gotten ready for this.
But as you mentioned, Mr. von Schirach, the thing is not stopping at trade. It is only the start, isn't it? If you look at the track record since last year about China-U.S. trade negotiation, the consultations, the thing is much more about the geopolitics. The thing is much about the number one do not want the number two to climb up unless it is buying into all the demands of number one, which is impossible because it has a lot to do with sovereignty and many other issues. So Mr. von Schirach, it's likely, many suggest, that this uncertainty will continue for really quite some time, not just 1 year or two, but some time to go. So what would that mean to you if you look at the economic prospects? Go ahead.
Well, look, as the other panelists have also suggested, at the moment, the impact of this trade war on the American economy is minimal. Yes, there are some sectors, namely the exports from the farming sector, that are being hit hard, and the government, Washington, is coming to the rescue with subsidies and help and financial aid to the stricken farmers. But at the moment, the economy is doing pretty well. I mean, we have the highest rate of growth among the advanced industrial countries, way ahead of Europe, more than double the rate of growth of Europe. Yeah. Unemployment is at a historic minimum, so things are looking good. But of course, we haven't seen, the ripple effects as yet of the trade war, assuming that this will be protracted. What I would hope, and others hope too, is that there would be some kind of a grand bargain between the United States and China on the joint understanding of the rules of the game. I think this is the fundamental issue. The Americans, not only, as you pointed out, there is America as an established great economic power. There is China coming up and rising and rightfully claiming its place in the world economic panorama. And the Americans say, "Oh, you're cheating. You're not playing fair. You are breaking the rules." And China may say, "Well, these are rules that were made before we came on board." And there is a lot of dispute as to what the rules are and what they should be, and what intellectual property protection is, and what licensing means, and what technology transfer means. I am sure this can be, with goodwill, it could be agreed upon.
Very interesting.
It's complicated.
Very interesting.
Right
Professor Bastian, Mr. von Schirach, let's just give others some time as well to respond to this question. We have seen over the past decade, it's not rare that the allies of the United States did not necessarily agree every step of the way. The deeds, the actions, and the rhetorics, as well as the ways of doing things of the United States. However, very unlikely, including the European allies such as the UK, is going to budge against the U.S. practice. And now you see a U.S. practice coming into a different shape, what many call as the sharp power, meaning trying to overpower the others, use its enormous amount of economic and political might to let others follow suit. So are we going to see that continue in this and the next rounds of trade talks at a juncture of what many call great change, and yet we haven't seen how changes are likely to take in place? Professor Bastian.
I don't think we are likely to see that continue. We've seen already that Trump has immediately abandoned any sort of special relationship with the UK and special relationships with Europe. So I think I'm not quite in agreement with the fact that the Allies won't sort of budge from somehow supporting the US. I think they will. And when it came to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, many of them signed up specifically against the US, almost ordering them not to. So I think we will see a change in the balance of power. And I think from a brand management perspective, which is my perspective, I think the key to all this is the international rise of Chinese companies and Chinese brands. And I think that power will usurp the US political power. It has already started to do that, and that will do that more and more. And the Europeans, the UK economies and industries will be swayed by that and will form longer and deeper lasting relationships with China. And America really is going to be left out in the cold.
Mr. Hong, we have to be careful, don't we? In a way, because the America that we're talking about are quite different within itself. Certain groups believe in certain ways of globalization, others disagree. Some try to see the reality, others try to hide away, others taking America first, while some of the rest saying it's not. Mr. Hong, how are we seeing the division taking place in the U.S. itself, including what's going to happen today on Wednesday when Nancy Pelosi, the minority leader, the speaker rather, going to the White House and talking to President Trump? We know those things are likely to be the main theme of domestic politics for months to come until the election. So how are we going to see the internal division already happening and the many problems related to it very visible to the rest of the world, and the political fight as well, and their overall impact on every one of us in the rest of the world? Mr. Hong.
Yeah. Well, I think the hawks are now getting the upper hand in the U.S., and I think they're showing up in the approval rating and the polls as well, polls results as well. So I think, unfortunately, we can't rule out the possibility that Trump is using this so-called trade dispute to divert the attention from political pressure he's getting from the opponent parties. And also, there is also a risk that he's getting impeached because of his other wrongdoings. There are precedents that he use some other disputes with other countries to divert the political tensions. So there are many possibilities. I think for now because the market is undergoing sustained volatility. Yes. So I think for market participants they should be prepared for the worst, even though we're still hoping for the best.
Mr. von Schirach, I want to ask you related to that. There are concerns about American stock market being overvalued, stocks rather, overvalued. That is just a matter of fact for many economists around the world. There's also the issue about the currency, what's going to happen to the US dollar, the reserves as well as we speak, which is likely to have an enormous amount of impact on the rest of the world. So, Mr. von Schirach, besides the visible political or trade fight, how do you see this invisible, under the water, extremely important factors?
Well, look, yes, you're hitting a very important point. This is going to be pretty soon the longest economic recovery on record in history. Pretty soon. I think we're hitting the mark in a couple of months or something. So at some point the law of gravity prevails. Recoveries are not forever. And so whether it is the trade war with China that will precipitate, that will trigger a recession or a combination of other factors, we don't know. On the stock market, for sure, the stock market is inflated, and this is in large measure a legacy of the continuing policy of the Federal Reserve to have artificially depressed interest rates, which led to a bidding up of stocks, and also the fact that companies can borrow now at almost zero interest and use the money that they borrow to buy back their stocks is not a very good sign, because it means stocks are indeed inflated. Now, how much? It's a question of of dispute, but certainly they are inflated, and therefore there could be at some point the perfect storm sectors that go into recession because of the trade dispute, with China and other countries. The market getting spooked by some other event, and a gigantic sell-off. That's possible. I'm not predicting it, but I'm saying these are weak spots that are not immediately obvious in the day-to-day, headlines.
I see. The trade dispute, China-U.S., and probably between U.S. and other economies are already setting a quite dim tone of the global economy. Professor Bastian, before we go, what are the biggest concerns for you before we wrap it up?
I think the biggest concerns are, as your panelist said, the hawks and Trump. They're in the ascendancy. There doesn't seem to be a Democrat coming out and who can really change the political system, take a different approach at the moment. Hopefully that will happen. I think I'm also concerned for the American economy and American brands. I think they are less attractive around the world, and the rise of Chinese brands has a lot to do with that as well.
Thank you very much, the three of you, for being with us. Mike Bastian, Wang Shirak, and Hong Hao. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, as the Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations in Beijing draws to a close, the lessons and experiences from the cultures right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Next, we turn to China's first ever Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, which is wrapping up on Wednesday. The week-long event kicked off in Beijing last week with participants from 47 Asian countries and nearly 50 countries outside the region. Chinese President Xi Jinping keynoted the opening ceremony with an appeal for countries to treat each other as equals and to live in peaceful coexistence. The highlights of the Asian Civilization Week include Asian Cultural Carnival, involving more than 110 activities showing the diversity and charm of Asian civilizations. The conference is a new platform for promoting dialogues and exchanges among Asian civilizations at a time of rising populism and uncertainty in the world. And to discuss more about the results of all of these exchanges and the potential of cultural exchanges in the region and beyond, we are joined by Mr. Teng Jimeng, an associate professor from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Sir, welcome to our program. And also in New Delhi, we have Mr. Nadhav Nalapat, who is UNESCO Peace Chair and also Director of the Geopolitics and International Relations Department at Manipur University. So, Mr. Nalapat, good to see you. I hope we put aside the geopolitics a little bit. Let's talk about the culture, we hope. Professor Nalapat, help us to understand, really to you, in your eyes, what are real cultural exchanges? What could be termed as the real cultural exchanges?
Well, actually, the important thing is that this kind of a dialogue has now come center stage, and that too in China, which is, as has been said before, now the second largest economy in the world. The reality is that India and China together have more than 10,000 years of human history behind them. But the reality is that in the dialogue of the world, almost nothing of Asian civilization, of Asian culture, of Indian culture, of Chinese culture ever gets talked about. The only culture that continuously gets talked about, continuously gets highlighted, frankly, is the culture of Europe and the people who have migrated from Europe. So I'm happy to say that at long last, Asian cultures, Asian civilizations are taking an important role. And as I pointed out again, you have countries in the region. Korea, for example, is another example of thousands of years of culture. So many countries with thousands of years of culture. So I'm glad Asians are finally paying attention to their own cultures.
Well, of course I have to follow up a little bit, Professor Nalapat, because you talk about how much do we know about these cultures. But the question really is, how much do we know about these cultures ourselves, particularly about the ancient times, and whether dinosaurs are still relevant today? Professor Nalapat, without further ado, would you like to elaborate a little bit about this? Take India, for example, if you can. Give us some specific examples.
You know, I'd like to say that the pride in culture, pride in tradition is the foundation for future progress. Why is it, for example, in the United States, Indian students, Chinese students do very well? Because they know that they have a rich tradition to fall back on. They have a confidence in that tradition, a pride in that tradition. So certainly there has been an effort to make this pride extinct like the dinosaur, and to, in a sense, make us believe that we really don't have any culture worth remembering.
Yeah.
The fact is that we have great cultures, very much worth remembering, and I'm delighted again that we are remembering them and strengthening them, because in my view, you can claim the future only when you respect the past.
Well, yes, indeed, but that sounds a little bit abstract, that you have the pride of your thousands of years of culture. Exactly what are we talking about? Is there something that we could hold on to? Professor Teng, I have to ask you about that question. I mean, let me just give you an example. How many in India, particularly the younger generation, would understand the ancient India operas, which is a fascinating thing, just like kabuki in Japan? How many in China, the younger generation, would understand Peking opera or other ancient formats such as kunqu? This is just one of those examples of whether we really appreciate dinosaur or whether we just talk about it.
Absolutely. I think you're right in pointing to this very quote-unquote dinosaur part of this very civilization. I think that part of the civilization is still relevant and resonant in this very age of anti-globalization, protectionism, or security.
Well, you could
like
say
that.
it, but how? But
I
how?
mean, in this sense, I mean, how? I mean, to revitalize it by putting them on the stage, by putting them on the big screen, and introduce them into the campuses and into the classrooms so that the students may learn and revitalize and be part and basically internalize these cultures that we have to we forgot back in the past.
But of course, that is different, right? I mean, you know, market-wise, it's not necessarily going to survive. However, you have to put extra effort coming from, you know, the civil societies or the governments in order to do that. So what about its relationship of protecting these kind of dinosaurs, Professor Teng, vis-a-vis, let's just say, pop culture, which we are seeing all over the world?
Well, once again, I mean, government played a key role, for example, like you said, I mean, in kind of putting this back on track, or
visibility of them.
Improve the visibility of these great cultures. But then pop culture is different. Pop culture is basically a market behavior. I mean, once you created the market, I mean, pop culture would come in, and then it appeals. It appeals to young people. And so in this sense, I think old culture has to be made appealing to young generations. For example, Peking opera. I mean, very few people understand the very lyrics they sing, but now, how do they do that? Now they actually put all the lyrics on the side of the big screen and run them on neon lights. And so in this sense, I mean, people understand it. And so the first step is you have to let people understand these old dinosaurs.
Yeah, well, that's probably the first step, but how far will it go? It's still be a big question mark. Professor Nalapat, for India as well, Bollywood movies, of course, are much more welcomed and understood than, let's just say, some of the ancient operas in your country. What do you make of that phenomenon? What of it really, whether it's the Bollywood movies or the ancient operas that are really belong to what you consider as the huge tradition of Asian civilization, particularly India's old ancient civilizations?
Well, I'd like to point out that many of the dances of Bollywood still are classical. For example, Bharatnatyam, which is thousands of years old. Kuchipudi, which is again thousands of years old. Many of the songs have got traditions going back a considerable period of history. Now look at Asia. Look at, for example,
but
Korea
do people
pop.
know about
Korea
that? How
pop
many
is a
of them
fusion
are like
of
you
Korean
in India,
tradition.
Professor Nalapat, know exactly where the dances stem from? Where were they originally coming from? And why do they exist like they are?
Well, I must confess you're right. For a long period of time, we were really taught to believe that these cultures are too worthless to even talk about, to study, and we were taught to believe that we should just forget about them. You're perfectly right about that. But over the last several decades, that has changed, and people have started rediscovering their past. I was just recently in China. I went to some locations, for example, in Changsha. I went to some places in Hubei, and I saw, Hunan, Hubei, and I saw tens of thousands of people going there, many of them very young. So whether it's in China, whether it's in India, there's a going back to the past. And let me tell you, I mean, these were not morbid cultures. These were very vibrant cultures. And at one time, in 1820, China was the world's biggest economy, and India was the second biggest. So we're not talking more than 140, 150 years ago.
Now, here's the thing, Professor Tang. How should we update? Update about our knowledge about the so-called past and the treasures of our ancient civilizations, but also update the things that we could carry on from those treasures of ancient times. That at least takes picky eyes, reasonable thinking, huge society discussion, if not debates.
Yep.
And that existed through centuries, if you look at it in China over the past 200 years.
Well, once again, absolutely. I mean, these debates have been carried on forward for centuries in terms of this is supposed to be backward or advanced. And so to a large extent, that I think that we need to rely on new technologies. New technologies are actually helping us. And so take film, for example. I mean, film as an art form, and it was originally simply for entertainment, and now we use it for basically disseminating messages, disseminating images, and disseminating culture in general by putting them on the big screens, by making them colorful, by making them three-dimensional, and to make them actually multifaceted. And so in this sense, I think that film technology is a way to rediscover and carry on that very old tradition that we have been forgetting about in the past decade. And so young people now are also attracted to this very technology. And so take the internet, for example, and take this very three-dimensional or even AI technology. I mean, see, all these great technologies could be pressed at the service of humans to profess the greatness of human civilization.
Do technologies be able to save the lives of the ancient culture, or they're likely to overshadow the content of the cultures that we're talking about? Professor Nalapat.
Well, look, I want to point out that, if you go to the United States, if you go to China, if you go to Europe, larger number of people are becoming more vegetarian. They're taking less meat, for example. You go to China, you find a huge number of people, millions of young people are taking to yoga. Now that's an ancient culture come back to life. Traditional medicine, for example, traditional ways of healing, meditation. There are so many things in the past that are of value even in the present. And again, let me point out, these cultures were benign cultures. They didn't rely on conquest. They didn't rely on cruelty. I mean, let's be honest, in the 19th century and to the first half at least of the 20th century, there was so much cruelty, so much of conquest, so much of killing that took place when certain other cultures were dominant. So I personally believe, as my Chinese colleague said just now, that there is a vast treasure to be discovered. And yes, I agree fully with you that this has not been really seriously discovered yet, because we have been taught to believe that these are inferior, that these are not worth discovering.
I'm not sure whether we are being told that they are not worth discovering, but rather how to discover the real essence of it. I want to go to you, Professor Tang, before we wrap up. The so-called format vis-a-vis real essence. What are we learning? What are we really in a way, discovering?
Well, I think both contents and formats are important, especially nowadays in this age of internet, the age of AI, and these huge technology advances. And so I would strongly advocate to revitalize, to rediscover, and to reinvent these content to keep up with the times. Like President Xi said, we need to work together and revitalize and to keep up with the times so that we can share and create this very community of the shared interest and shared the future. Art and literary works served this very interest, and art and literature should be preserved, and also made live again out there on the street, on the stage, in the classrooms with technologies.
Well, of course, it's important to have the strong belief, but it also takes daily work in order to really discover and see the real essence of cultures and treasure them with real actions. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. Teng Jimeng and also Madhav Nalapat. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight, CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.